Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Aditya Billur, and I'm currently a rising senior at the Downingtown STEM Academy. Today, I would like to discuss about polio and the journey of eradication. So, I'd like to begin with a little overview of my presentation. I will start with a little introduction about myself, go into the background of polio, and then important historical discoveries and the achievements of polio in the pursuit of eradication of polio and the global eradication campaign, specifically in the United States. And I'll also be trying to draw some parallels between the poliovirus and the current coronavirus pandemic at hand. So let's start with a little introduction of myself. I am a current senior at the Downingtown STEM Academy, and I love biology, chemistry, and psychology at the moment. And two of my favorite hobbies are participating in my school's marching band and playing cricket. Now let's jump into my inspiration for this presentation. So I started by reading more about the poliovirus, and I was interested to see the connections that I could draw with it and the current coronavirus pandemic. And I was really inspired when I read this book, Polio, The Odyssey of Eradication by Thomas Abraham. It was a huge inspiration for me to actually pursue my interest in this disease, or in this virus. And let's jump into a little bit of background about this. So polio is short for poliomyelitis, and it's caused by one of three types of polioviruses, which are all members of the enterovirus genus. They're all labeled type 1, type 2, and type 3. Enteroviruses spread through contact between nasal and oral secretions and by contact with contaminated feces. So the poliovirus enters the body through the mouth and multiplies along the way to the digestive tract and then further multiplies there. But in about 98% of cases, polio is a mild illness and with no symptoms and sometimes viral-like symptoms. But in paralytic polio, the virus leaves the digestive tract and enters the bloodstream and then begins to attack nerve cells, which to me was really interesting that an enterovirus would actually cause paralysis. So fewer than 1 to 2% of people who contract polio become paralyzed. And it essentially attacks the nerve cells in the spinal cord and then causes muscle wasting and then leads to paralysis in serious cases. And another important thing is that polio is very contagious and it spreads through person-to-person contact. So an infected person may spread the virus to others immediately before and up to about 2 weeks after symptoms appear. So this is another parallel to the current COVID-19 pandemic. And now important historical discoveries in the eradication of polio are, well, there's multiple, but then if I had to pick out three, I would start with Bowden and Morgan's discovery of the three different types of polioviruses. So in 1949, Dr. David Bowden and Isabel Morgan, both researchers at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, published a paper identifying three different types of polioviruses. Their work would be crucial in determining a vaccine because a vaccine would ideally need to provide immunity against all three types of the polioviruses. So a trivalent vaccine would be the spark for that, and the trivalent vaccine provided immunity for all three types of polioviruses. Now, the Salk and the Sabin vaccine are the vaccines that are most used today to vaccinate children against polio, and the polio has the most devastating effects in children. So these two vaccines are most often used. And the Salk vaccine was created by Jonas Salk, and he created this vaccine using an inactivated or killed form of the polioviruses. So he believed that it would be less dangerous than a live vaccine because a live vaccine may accidentally cause polio if in those inoculated. And when administered, 90% of or more of the recipients developed protective antibodies to all three types of the poliovirus. Now, the Sabin vaccine was also known as the OPV, was created using an attenuated or weakened form of the polioviruses. It's administered through oral polio drops versus the Salk vaccine, which was administered through injection. So the difference between the Salk and the Sabin vaccine was that the Sabin vaccine actually had the ability to revert back to its original wild poliovirus form and actually cause paralysis in rare cases. So I think in 1 in every 2.7 million cases of the OPV administered, it would lead to something called VAP, which stands for Vaccine-Associated Paralytic Polio. So the risk of this actually varies by dose and setting, but both vaccines are still used in combination with each other to combat polio and vaccinate children against this deadly virus. Now, so we look at this map. So in 1988, it shows that primarily a lot of these countries they didn't eradicate polio, they didn't eliminate polio. There's only very few countries, the United States, Canada, parts Australia and such, they would actually that were a bit successful in eliminating polio. But then in 2018, the map was almost flipped. You see a lot more countries, the majority of countries actually have eliminated polio, with only a few pockets where countries haven't, and that's because the virus is endemic in nature in those countries. Through long and tiring campaigns, though, the 2018 result has been achieved. And now specifically in the United States, the poliovirus eradication campaign took hold with mass immunization campaigns. So first off, in 1952, there were more than 21,000 cases of paralytic polio. It was a disease that needed recognition, and it claimed recognition in the United States. So this mass immunization campaigns began with the OPV, the oral polio vaccine drops, but those are more regularly used. But initially, actually started with the IPV. It started with using an injectable for the initial vaccine. And eventually that was phased out though in 1968 due to the creation of the new Sabin vaccine. The Sabin vaccine, it was simple, it was just 2 drops at regular intervals, and a child would be immunized against polio. It was cost effective, it was easier to deliver, and it became the vaccine of choice to combat polio. Now, polio was eventually eradicated from the United States in 1979, but this wasn't the case in many other countries. In 1988, the World Health Organization aimed to eradicate polio by the year 2000, but this was not going to be that straightforward because global eradication campaigns require billions of dollars of funding. They need support from multiple different countries, and they need to match each country's public healthcare system and current status. So the main word often associated with this global eradication campaign is fatigue, because eradication campaigns are inherently supposed to be short, rapid bursts where mass immunization occurs to stamp out a disease from a certain country. But the polio eradication campaign was the exact opposite. It was lengthy, it was tiring, but it eventually crossed the finish line and managed to achieve eliminating polio from a majority of countries. Now, this brings me to my conclusion that the key takeaways from this poliovirus epidemic that can be applied to our current coronavirus pandemic stage. So global eradication campaigns require lots of consistent funding and continued support. So disease may be eradicated at different times in various countries, and this is something that we all should take into consideration when we're dealing with our current pandemic at hand. And on top of that, polio took about 30 years to eradicate from the majority of countries. So it may be illogical at the moment to assume that the coronavirus may be gone or eradicated in the next 1 to 2 years. It may take a lot more than that and a lot more effort. And that brings me to my last point. Vaccine trials and testing procedures require lots of time and lots of revision through different phases of testing. And that can be due to new gained knowledge from experience. So the Salk and the Sabin vaccines for the poliovirus, they took about 15 to 20 years to develop. So this vaccine development is going to take a while, and that's another thing we have to keep in mind when looking at our current COVID-19 situation. And that brings me to my citations, and I've also attached my email at the bottom of this slide, adityabillur23@gmail.com. If you guys would like to converse with me and chat with me about anything about this presentation, I would be glad to do so. And I would take this time to thank my parents and my family members for always encouraging me to pursue my interest in medicine. And I would also specifically like to thank Dr. Gopi Krishna, Dr. Shikha Durma, and Dr. Balavardhan for inspiring me to, again, even further pursue my interest in medicine. And if anything in this presentation really stuck out to you guys and really was interesting, I would highly recommend the first source of my citation, a book by Thomas Abraham, The Polio, the Odyssey of Eradication. It goes into a lot more detail about some of the topics I briefly mentioned. And I'd also like to thank the Global Health Leaders Conference for providing this opportunity to interact with you all on this global stage. It has been an absolute blast, and it's been an honor and pleasure in my eyes to present this. I've had a lot of fun compiling this, and I thank you all for your time today.